How did Israel become the internet's favorite villain? How did people virtually within a matter of years who have nothing in common, folks from the progressive far left, folks from the far right, atheists, Islamists, all unify under the banner that Israel is now the villain? And how much of this is self-imposed? Now, what I don't want to do in this video is minimize the utter catastrophe that has been happening in Gaza. The reality is there's been civilians dying, there's been issues with getting humanitarian aid there, and there's been the first ever war we've witnessed on social media. And I've been on the record myself for publicly criticizing Israel as someone that has been to Israel, primarily because I come from an Armenian ethnic background where I was a refugee from Azerbaijan, Baku, and Israel has an alliance with Azerbaijan to this day, despite having a massive Armenian population and a quarter of the old city in Jerusalem belonging to the Armenian community. Israel has also not officially acknowledged the Armenian genocide, though they have in other ways acknowledged how horrible it was. So I have never looked at Israel through rose-colored lenses. And when I did visit Israel at the end of 2022, almost a year before October 7th, I was probably the only one within our group from Israel Collective that would push back and ask hard questions to some of the things that we were discussing. Yet, despite all of that, you'll still see comments in this video of the most nuanced and reasonable take on Israel, asking me if I've gotten my $7,000 check from the government. And I haven't. I've never been paid a dime from Israel. The most obvious way that this entire conversation has shifted specifically around how Israel is perceived is Ben Shapiro's scorching hot popularity in the late 2010s to now.
40,000 people have died, including Palestinians and Israelis, and large numbers of children and civilians. How can you continue to condone those actions?
Okay, hold on. I want to correct you. I don't just condone the actions of the Israeli Defense Forces and the Israeli government. I celebrate and laud them.
Being kind of scoffed at by many in the far-right circles, specifically with the likes of Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and Nick Fuentes. And what I'm not saying is that there isn't grounds to criticize Israel. But it does seem that the criticism of Israel has shifted from policy to flat-out accusation. And this has been a huge dividing line, especially folks in the conservative movement and in the media independent movement. I used to love watching Breaking Points, but it sounds like they've completely gone in the anti-Zionist route. So what is Zionism, and how much of this did Israel contribute to? And what is happening in Gaza? Is there a genocide? Is the Talmud actually against Christians? Is there evidence that Jewish people constantly spit on Christians when they visit Israel? What role does APEC play in controlling American politics? How has social media played into this conflict? And is Israel ultimately built on stolen land by a bunch of people that aren't really Jews? They're just Jewish. We're going to get into all of that in this video. And shocker, when I talk about topics like this, I tend to catch heat from both sides. Whenever I've spoken on Israel before, like on a Sean Ryan podcast, I've literally had people DM me from the pro-Israel side demanding that I get re-educated on certain things that I've said, like what's happening in Gaza is pretty brutal and they should clean that up. And I also constantly get attacked from folks on the far right, specifically in the groper crowd, of being a Zionist shill and so on and so forth. And to me, if you're getting attacked from both sides, then perhaps you're onto something. So I'm going to do my best to explore all this as objectively as I can. I'm also going to provide you with other resources and longer videos for you to come to your own conclusions on what exactly is happening here and why is the group of people that seems to be hated the most throughout all of history seems to be the internet's biggest villain. I think the sentiment towards Israel is probably best demonstrated that when Trump and Israel and Hamas finally brokered a ceasefire peace deal, that much of the chatter online remained outrage. There was calls for a ceasefire came, and now people are still mad about a ceasefire. This is likely most evidenced by the protests that continued even after the ceasefire.
Can I speak to you quickly? Why protest today, given that we're kind of 24 hours after a ceasefire came into effect?
The genocide has happened and we need it ended. We need it ended completely and we need to be sure of that.
or from personalities like Candace Owens, who made statements like this when there's seemingly progress being made in the region.
If you're reading the headlines, a peace agreement is what we're calling it, has been reached between Israel and Hamas. Oh my gosh, because they decided that there's going to be phases and Israel is going to partially withdraw its troops from Gaza. And yeah, like hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are missing. And yeah, they have destroyed 85% of Gaza. And they're going to try to tell us that we've reached peace. And we're supposed to go, wow, that's amazing. Trump put a statement out on Truth Social. He wrote, I'm very proud to announce that Israel and Hamas have both signed off on the first phase of our peace plan. This means that all the hostages will be released very soon, and Israel will withdraw their troops to an agreed upon line. I can't even finish it because it makes me sick that they think we're this dumb. But we're supposed to thank them. We're supposed to thank the monsters that did this.
Pretty interesting reaction to a peace treaty, right? This is what people have been protesting for, to finally see a ceasefire in Gaza. Yet when that finally comes, all of a sudden the criticism gets turned to the people who made the ceasefire happen. Interesting, to say the least. Now, another thing that is interesting is the way that language can get used, changed, and abused with regards to a conversation like this, bringing us to the first point I'd like to discuss with you, the idea of Zionism. On the internet, Zionism has become an absolutely horrendous term. It is used as a word to describe what many people would say is someone that just writes Israel a blank check and allows them to do anything they want. But the reality is the term Zionism is actually a very sensible position. Let me explain. Zionism is simply the nationalist movement that supports the established and self-determination of a Jewish homeland in the land of Israel. Okay, it emerged in the late 19th century as a response to the anti-Semitism all over Europe, where Jews had spread to, and was trying to get the people that are Jewish back into their homeland. This led to the creation of Israel in 1948. And today, when someone is a Zionist, it simply means that they support the continued existence of the state of Israel. Because whether or not people like it, the reality is Israel's here and Israel is not going anywhere. And if you are okay with Israel existing, that makes you a Zionist. Now, there are different types of Zionists. There are Christian religious Zionists that believe that Israel has a right to the homeland because of biblical prophecies. This would be folks that are in the dispensationalist camp, folks like Jack Hibbs, or folks that hold to a more dual covenant theology that don't necessarily think that Jews need to be preached the gospel. This would be someone like John Hagee, who has said that he doesn't think that Jews need to be saved, that they're still under a different covenant, dual covenant view. Then there are people who aren't religious Zionists, but they just hold to the idea that Israel should have a right to exist in their ancestral homeland. This would be someone like David Wood or Apostate Prophet. They are unapologetically Zionist, but they don't hold to dispensational views of end times theology. It's less of a theological position and more of a pragmatic position. And then there are Jewish people who aren't religious Zionists. There are Jewish people who are Orthodox Jews who don't really care for the right to the ancestral homeland. Those folks also exist. So there's a wide spectrum of opinions on this. But the basic premise is that Zionism is simply a movement of Jewish people that wasn't intrinsically religious. It was more nationalistic to have them come back to their ancestral homeland. This was due to historical pressures like the pogroms and European anti-Semitism, as well as anti-Semitism in many of the Arab and Muslim states in the region that you saw the Jewish populations dwindle. This ultimately led to a UN partition plan that was accepted by the Jews and rejected by the Arabs. And in 1948, once Israel declared their independence, you saw 5 different armies invade Israel. And tragically, 750,000 Palestinians that were in the land were told to leave the land and then not allowed to return. Israel survived, but just barely. And Zionism didn't come out of thin air, and it wasn't some mass conspiracy. It was a means for survival of people who are Jewish. So one doesn't have to agree with every Israeli policy or believe that Benjamin Netanyahu is doing a good job in Gaza in order to acknowledge why Jewish people would want the right to return to their homeland. Now, again, guys, this is a YouTube video. I'm not going to cover everything extensively, but there are other resources I'll link below. If you want the least biased video you can watch on this, I'd recommend checking out this video from Elephants in Rooms, Did Jews Steal Palestine? I think it does a great job of condensing the conflict in 18 minutes. I can't get into all of it here. But I do want to get into the concern that APEC and Jewish lobbying in America has had too much influence over American politics. This is a claim that's often thrown out with very little context. And another great resource on this that I would recommend everybody watch, just on the general idea of Zionism, is a debate between Dave Smith and Coleman Hughes. Another great resource on this conversation. And when the conversation of APEC comes out, Coleman Hughes did something very interesting. He fact-checked Dave Smith in real time and pointed to how preposterous it really is that Israel and APEC and Jews have so much lobbying power in America just based on the sheer numbers. Check it out.
The idea that the domestic Israel lobby is big enough or powerful enough to get America to fight an entire war that we would not otherwise have fought is to me ridiculous. During the entire George W. Bush administration, the Israel lobby spent $17 million lobbying Congress. Now that might sound like a lot to me or you. It is absolute chump change on the scale of domestic lobbying. To put it in perspective, the tobacco lobby spent $200 million, so more than 10 times that amount over the same time period. And they couldn't even stop Congress from passing a federal tax hike on cigarettes in 2009. Now, during the Obama era, the Israel lobby spent $30 million. And they were outspent by the dentists. The dentist lobby spent $32 million. This is all according to opensecrets.org, which is usually the standard source people go to for such figures. This is, again, not to repeat my favorite phrase, but like a firefly to the sun when compared to the $2 billion, for instance, that Wall Street spent lobbying Congress, and they couldn't even prevent Dodd-Frank from being passed.
I mean, look, there's no question, like APEC supported the war, and some of these other, or the American Enterprise Institute, they all supported the war, and they threw money toward that, and they lobbied for it. But this was a neoconservative war. Yet this war doesn't happen without the neoconservatives. And I think John Mearsheimer very reasonably puts them as part of the Israel lobby. All you have to do is read their own words. It's not like I'm putting together some conspiracy. By the way, I love that Mearsheimer points out in that book, because I do think there's a real interesting point to make, that he's not saying it was a Jewish war. Like, the Jewish people in America actually opposed the war in Iraq much more so than just about any other group. I think the polling data was they were way out ahead against the war in Iraq. I forget the exact numbers.
Yes,
but yeah, there's no question that, call it whatever you want to. I mean, like they would basically through the 90s self-identify as the American version of the Likudnik Party, but whatever you want to call it, these group of people who have, in their own words, admitted they have like profound loyalty and connection to Israel, pushed for this war, and they had written in their own words that a huge part of it was because this was the strategy.
Now, you really should go watch this entire debate between Dave Smith and Coleman Hughes. And by the way, Coleman Hughes, as far as I know, is definitely not a Christian. He is not really a conservative. I don't know how much of a Zionist he is. He's probably a Zionist in a very general pragmatic sense, but not in any sort of religious way. And he laid out a very, very, very strong case against a lot of the narrative with APEC and outside Israel money in comparison to how much money actually gets spent by other nations. Now, APEC is interesting in that it's not registered as a foreign entity, but it is often ran by folks in America who are Jewish and have Jewish interests. And something many folks don't know is there's between 100 to 300,000 American citizens who also hold Israeli citizenship. Now, why is that significant? There's only like 16 million Jews alive today worldwide. About 7.4 million of them live in Israel. And again, between 1 to 300,000 of them hold dual citizenship between Israel and America. Now, should APEC be registered differently? I think that's a different conversation for a different day. I don't really have opinions on that. But when people throw out this whole APEC is pulling the strings of American politics, when you compare it to other entities, it's just not true. Again, if you look up how much Israel spent in 2024, it's about $3.3 million. In comparison, Qatar has spent $12 million annually and a total of $250 million. And so you have a very small population of people that tends to have a pretty big impact in terms of their influence, primarily, in my opinion, because of their views on education and work ethic and maintaining tight-knit communities where the money that they spend, specifically the dollar, stays circulating within their communities. And these are just some of the reasons why Jewish people tend to be so successful and outperform other groups. And speaking of keeping the dollar within the community, one of the things I always find very interesting is how so many Christians refuse to apply this. They will go out and spend their money with pagans who hate them, hate their God, hate everything that they represent. And then when Christians have small businesses or have resources for sale, they will then mock them or criticize them for doing such things. Which gets me to the point that today is actually our last sale for our Black Friday, Cyber Monday weekend. Our lowest prices of the year. You can get our Bless God Discipleship Bundle for $57. That includes our 60-day devotional, our leadership planner, and a prayer journal, plus a 25% discount on top of the super low price. We also have the Occupy Till I Come t-shirt. We also have this section of Ruslan's picks with the Occupy Till I Come t-shirt. We have the Occupy Till I Come Dove hat. This is a hat that Forrest Frank actually wore that immediately sold out. The Reversible Armor of God denim jacket that's both Japanese salvage denim as well as reversible, and a bomber jacket on the other side. This is the cheapest the jacket's ever going to get. So anyway, the hoodie that I'm wearing is also on sale for $49 plus 25% off. So support what we do here. Go to blessgod.co. The link is pinned up in the comment, and you'll actually see some of these items underneath the video as well. It's a great way to partner with what we're doing. All right, let's jump back into this video. Now, remember when I mentioned earlier in the video that a bunch of folks who have nothing in common, from the progressive far left to the far right to atheists to even Christians, all of a sudden disliking Israel. Well, one of the things that's interesting is that we kind of seen all that culminate, and specifically in the city that has the second largest Jewish population. Now, remember, many of the conversations around this is that Jewish people operate a one world cabal and control everything that's going on in media and happening in culture and business and the banks and so on and so forth. Now, what I find interesting about this is that New York City just elected its first ever Democratic Socialist Muslim mayor, someone that has openly went on to say that he is totally cool with global intifada. Now, many would identify global intifada as an incitement of violence towards Israel and Jewish people, giving the context of the two intifadas that have happened in Israel over the course of its history. And those intifadas were periods of Palestinian violence against Israelis that included bombings on school buses, kids getting slaughtered, stabbings, and all sorts of other attacks against Israel. So I want you just to think for a second. This group of people that is viewed as being the puppeteers of all things global are also incapable of leveraging their vast influence to prevent an openly Democratic Socialist Muslim mayor from getting elected in the city where they have the second largest population. Sounds like a very poorly ran Illuminati global cabal of Jewish leaders, if you ask me. Now, what many people will also bring up is, Ruslan, what about the Talmud's hostility towards Jesus? Specifically, the quote that Jesus is burning in excrement. And what about the treatment of Christians by Jewish people in Israel? Now, when this is often thrown out, what I find interesting is most folks don't even know what the Talmud is. The Talmud is not a catechism. It is not a doctrine and theology book. The Talmud is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of different rabbis debating different things. It's not official doctrine, it's arguments. And some of those arguments go on very long. Now, there is a line in there about a Yeshua who is burning in human excrement. But what many Jewish people will point out is that they're not even sure if that's talking about the same Yeshua that we know to be Jesus of Nazareth, as well as that's not settled and official Jewish teaching. That is different rabbis debating and arguing about these things. Now, let me be very clear. I'm not saying that Jews are cool with Christians worshiping Jesus. I'm not saying that Jews are always friendly to Christians. We've seen some of the videos of Christians in Israel getting spat on by the ultra-Orthodox. Now, what's interesting about that is twofold. What's left out often is that the ultra-Orthodox in Israel are often not religious Zionists, and two, that the ultra-Orthodox who do spit towards Christians are often charged in Israel for said things. Because the way this is positioned by the Nick Funtez's and the folks on the far right is that, see, look, Christians are getting persecuted in Israel by the Jewish people, leaving out that this is often followed by arrests. People have been arrested for this as recently as October 2023, where 5 were arrested in Jerusalem's Old City for spitting on or near Christian pilgrims. And at least one person was arrested in February 2024 for spitting at a Christian priest. Israeli police stated that arrests were made in connection with viral videos that showed ultra-Orthodox Jews spitting at or near Christian visitors. So this isn't something that's sanctioned by the government of Israel. This isn't something that is common. This is a fringe of a fringe, specifically the ultra-Orthodox, who, by the way, aren't very popular in Israel, attacking certain Christians that are there. I also find it interesting that it's often left out that Israel is the only place in the Middle East where the Christian population is growing. And in terms of how Christians are treated in Israel, that leads me to something personal. As an Armenian who is a refugee from Azerbaijan, Baku, the situation in the Armenian quarter has been frustrating and heartbreaking at times. For those that don't know, Armenians have a very deep history in Israel, going all the way back to the 4th century. This is why, till this day, there's an Armenian quarter in the old city of Jerusalem. A quarter is allocated for the Muslims, a quarter is allocated for the Armenians, a quarter is allocated for the Jews, and a quarter is allocated for the Christians. And right now there is a fight over land because there was a massive development deal that was signed behind the back of the Armenians in that area, and they're potentially trying to build a massive luxury hotel right in the center of that. And the Armenian community has been protesting it for years. The Jerusalem municipality has also attempted to slap back taxes on this community and are threatening a seizure of some of the church land that's always been exempt from taxes. And yeah, there's been real incidents of harassment against Armenians in the old city. Often this is by fringe extremist groups, not typical Israelis, and despite Israel condemning it, the tension continues. So as an Armenian from Azerbaijan, this is very complicated for me. Israel is aligned with Azerbaijan that displaced Armenian people from that region and is the reason why I came to the United States as a refugee. As a matter of fact, just 2 weeks prior to October 7th, we saw over 100,000 Armenians displaced from Azerbaijan, the Nagorno-Karabakh region in Azerbaijan. Oddly enough, no one had a word to say about it. All the people that are upset about what's happening in Gaza didn't report on this at all. And as I said earlier, it is frustrating that Israel won't formally acknowledge the Armenian genocide committed by the Turks in 1915. So believe me, I am not blind to Israel's faults and flaws. But calling out Israel's hypocrisy is not the same as demonizing for every single thing that happens globally or denying their right to exist, which is what the anti-Zionist cause actually is. I say all that to say what we really need is solid, nuanced conversations, the kind that we're seeing happen by Coleman Hughes and Dave Smith, and not more hysteria or worse, flat out anti-Semitic tropes repackaged for today, because it's much easier to blame a foreign nation somewhere over there than to take ownership and responsibility for the things that we can control. Now, this is a very long and ongoing conflict, and I don't have the time to get into all of it, but it is important to note that, yes, there were 750,000 Palestinians that were displaced from their land as Israel was attacked by 5 different nations. And those 750,000 Arabs were told to leave with the hope of returning back. And unfortunately, they weren't able to return back because those 5 nations lost. There's also been multiple peace offers. Just this week, President Bill Clinton went viral yet again for an old video of him describing that there was a pretty good offer on the table that would have given Palestinians a good amount of land with the Oslo Accords with Camp David in the year 2000. Yet the Palestinian leader at the time, Arafat, walked away. This led to continued tensions and intifadas and ultimately Israel pulling out of the Gaza Strip, which then allowed the Gaza Strip to be taken over by the more radical Hamas and ultimately culminated to a bunch of wars and then the horror that many people saw on October 7th, which leads us to the most emotionally charged part of this conversation, Gaza. After October 7th, support for Israel was wildly popular. And on the night of October 7th, I actually tweeted that I'm concerned because sometimes the IDF can be heavy-handed with the way that they engage with the Palestinians. Well, this, of course, caught me a ton of backlash from my predominantly Christian audience at the time, but I think I kind of called it. And as Gaza unfolded, the first war that we've really seen on social media, and the rising tensions from the progressive left and the far right, as well as the Islamicists, to rally together and point out to the horrors of what was happening in Gaza. And just recently, the UN has came out and said that Israel has checked out 4 out of the 5 of the points that is considered a genocide. Now, before I unpack that, I do want to explore the idea of Gaza and what would happen from the context of first principles. I figured I'd highlight someone that's also been having great conversations on this and actually has had some of these debates on his channel, Constantine from the channel Trigonometry. He approaches this conflict from the idea of first principles, meaning when you strip everything down to the bare bones and say I were to grant every single pro-Palestinian talking point, where would we end up October 7th? Where would we end up October 8th? Now that they're here and now that they do exist, what do you think follows what we saw on October 7th? Let him explain a bit more.
If we accept that October 7th was a terrorist attack, as I believe most people do, the obvious approach would be to compare it to other terrorist attacks in recent history. That, as it happens, is impossible, because on a proportionate basis, the Western world has never experienced an attack on this scale. If we take 9/11, the most impactful terrorist attack in living memory, which shook the world's dominant superpower to its very core, we see that 2,977 people were killed in a country of 285 million people. On October 7th, approximately 1,200 people were killed in a country of just 9 million people. Some keep calling October 7th Israel's 9/11. That isn't remotely true. If October 7th was Israel 9/11, on a per capita basis, only 100 people would have been killed. In other words, October 7th was at least 12 times as bad as 9/11. And that's before accounting for the fact that Hamas took hundreds of hostages, many of whom have been killed since. So the obvious question is, if thousands of armed Mexicans had penetrated the southern border of the United States, killed 36,000 Americans, and dragged off thousands of hostages, how would America have reacted? Would there still be a Mexico to speak of? Whatever your view of the history of this conflict, I believe the logic of this is impenetrable. However, there are some persuasive arguments from the anti-Israel camp which are aimed at contextualizing October 7th. Let's look at them. Number one, history did not start on October 7th. The crux of this argument, when broken down to its central premise, is that the state of Israel is illegitimate. In this conception, Israel was created because land belonging to Palestinians was taken by Western powers and given to European Jews fleeing the Holocaust. Palestinians were not consulted, did not give consent, and found themselves kicked out of their homes. Israel is a settler colonial state. 2. October 7th was a response to Israeli brutality and oppression. Those of you who watched my debate with Safety Namas will recall that he made this argument repeatedly. The people of Gaza and the West Bank are treated so badly, he argued, the response we saw on October 7th was totally understandable. An act of resistance aimed at redressing the wrongs they have suffered. 3. Israel is killing civilians. The scenes of parents pulling their children out of rubble speak for themselves. 4. Israel is engaged in indiscriminate attacks, which is why so many innocent people are dying. This argument aims to prove that Israel is the bad guy in this war because it is killing lots of people, either deliberately or due to a callous disregard for the lives of Palestinians.
Now, you really should go watch Constantine's entire video on this, but I think it is a fair question to ask if what happened by Israel was executed on America in the same way by Mexico, which can make a similar argument that America and specifically states like California and Arizona are stolen land. What would happen to Mexico? What would happen to the cartels that did such an awful thing? I live in San Diego, by the way, which is shares a border with Mexico. I think it's possible that America may do much more harm to Mexico than Israel did to Gaza. Now, that may sound cold and callous, but that is the reality that war is hell. It is awful. And many of us forget that we live in a pretty dark world. And when you compare the death rates in Israel of civilians versus the Hamas soldiers, you start to discover that their rate is actually substantially better than what America did in Iraq. The only difference is that we didn't have social media in Iraq. We also didn't have people understanding that they can use social media to create specific narratives to further push their agenda with the pro-Palestinian cause. That seems to still be protesting and angry even after there was a peace treaty deal signed. Now, with regards to the accusations of genocide, I think that that can be explored as well. But this is what I find interesting. With regards to genocide, it still kind of comes back to the UN and that being an authority without always having all the details on the ground. It is an appeal to authority. The interesting thing about appeals to authority is that if I were to use that same approach of what is the scholarly consensus, what is the standard views of history, much of the rhetoric being propagated by the Candace Owens, the Tucker Carlsons, the Nick Funteses, the overall woke right would completely fall apart under scholarly consensus, with Tucker Carlson's abhorrent views that World War II was really unnecessary to get into and Winston Churchill was kind of really the bad guy, to Nick Funtes's flat-out anti-Semitism nonsense and conspiracy spreading, or Candace Owens's repeated claims about the Frankists and the Jews being a secret cult that peddled and protected. all of these things would instantly fall apart if we're going to pull the what is the consensus to authority. And the criteria of what is a genocide falls into 5 different aspects, one of which is about Gaza being starved and that entire conversation. Now, again, you can check out Elephants in Room video on this, Is Israel Starving Gaza? And you can look at the multi-layered, complicated nature of Hamas using human shields that often result in higher casualties, which they've gone on the record and have openly admitted, and then also grabbing the humanitarian aid that's finally getting into Gaza and not allowing their own people to get access to it, as well as their own citizens. The reality is that in these sorts of conflict, the media is being manipulated by both sides. There were tons of alleged bombings of hospitals that were proved to be false by Israel. And then there were also times where Israel accidentally hit churches. And I don't think there's anything wrong with saying those accidents shouldn't happen. But saying something is a genocide simply because the UN said so will fall apart when you look at all of the other claims that are backdoored within this conversation around Israel. That if I were honest, I don't know if the vitriol and the hatred toward Israel would still stand if you remove the commentary of the Candace Owens, Nick Fuentes, Ian Carrolls, and Tucker Carlson's. Meaning you can't reject the consensus of Holocaust historians, World War II scholars, Middle East historians, but then turn around and selectively say, well, the UN said genocide, therefore it's absolutely a genocide. That's not critical thinking. That's cherry picking the authority that confirms your own bias. Now, there's so many more things that I really want to get into on this conversation. Specifically, are the Jews really Jewish with regards to DNA and Ashkenazi Jews, and going a little deeper on some of the conflict. But what I do know is this: Israel and the policies of Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu are not above critique. And I think there will be legitimate questions that need to be answered with specifically exactly what happened on October 7th. I've been up to Gaza before. I've seen the security there. How can something like that happen? How can the ball be dropped that bad? I think those are valid questions. I think it's also valid to acknowledge that Israel has had some historical issues with their relationship with Palestinians. It's not all peachy. There is forms of racism and oppression and the disputed regions of the settlements, and I think that's all fair to discuss as well. But turning Israel into the world's cartoonish villain is just dishonest. You see, 2 things can be true at the same time. Israel has made mistakes and had accidents, and we can say, hey, can you please stop that? Can you do better to not have as many accidents, while at the same time not acting like Israel is committing a Holocaust 2.0 in Gaza? And that leads me to what I think could be the deeper issue on this. And I'll make a part 2 of this video if you want me to, with regarding to the influence of Islamicists and the far right and the far left. But this is ultimately what I think happened. In the same way that we saw Trump derangement syndrome rip apart entire communities and friendships fall apart, we're now seeing the same thing with Israel derangement syndrome. You see, derangement replaces nuance and the need for healthy conversation and debate with dogma. Curiosity replaces outrage with understanding. Try to steelman Israel's position in all this. Regardless on if you think they're a legitimate nation and how they got their funding, really try to see it from Israel's perspective, which, by the way, most Israelis are not religious. Most Israelis aren't big fans of Benjamin Netanyahu. Most Israelis are actually not Ashkenazi Jews, which is what many people have issues with, the ultra-Orthodox. Most Israelis who are Jewish are actually Sephardic Jews. These are all things that people don't know and won't know unless they go and visit and experience Israel for themselves. This is a super complicated issue, not to mention the 2 million Arabs who live in Israel and share Israeli citizenship. Those folks maybe aren't always treated the same way as native Israelis, but they are Israeli citizens. That is also a reality for many Palestinian Arabs who are Israeli citizens. That often doesn't get talked about. So here's the truth. The truth doesn't always fit nicely on a protest sign. The truth is often complicated. It's messy. There's a lot of layers to it, a lot of history, a lot of anger on both sides. And as someone that's been to Israel and someone that's experienced Israel, not in some guided tour, but actually went in and talked to what Christians' life is like in Israel, talked to what Palestinians' life are like in Israel, talked to all sorts of different people in Israel. When I was there and still having friends on the ground, man, Israel is much like the United States. It is not a monolith. There is a lot of infighting. There's a lot of issues. They are constantly trying to figure out how they can coexist with the Palestinian people. And it's just tragic that there was offers for peace that were rejected. And I think most Israelis would love to exist with Palestinians and live in harmony. But unfortunately, that's not where we are. And I hope and pray that someday that will happen. And ultimately, one doesn't have to be a Christian Zionist, a dispensationalist, a dual covenant theology guy to acknowledge that Israel's here and they're not going anywhere. And as much as people are upset about APEC and America sending aid to Israel, which, by the way, 80% of that aid gets spent on American weapons, meaning we're not shipping bags of money over there for them to do whatever they want with, where they're getting funds to buy American weapons that leads to more American jobs. But most people don't know that. Most people aren't in the weeds and trying to have these conversations. It's short form, social media, get after the clicks, and create a villain out of a group of people that have historically been viewed as a villain. It's sad, and it seems like history keeps repeating itself, that the people who have experienced so much persecution throughout history are now again having so much hostility. You don't believe this is an issue? Let me point out to when the United States asked multiple presidents of some prestigious colleges if calling for the genocide of Jews violates their code of conduct. Now, imagine if this question was asked about the transformer community, the LGBT community, any other minority community. What do you think the answer would be? But many people forgot just how detrimental this really was. Take a look for yourself.
Ms. McGill, at Penn, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Penn's rules or code of conduct? Yes or no?
If the speech turns into conduct, it can be harassment. Yes.
I am asking, specifically calling for the genocide of Jews, does that constitute bullying or harassment?
If it is directed and severe or pervasive, it is harassment.
So the answer is yes.
It is a context-dependent decision, Congresswoman.
It's a context-dependent decision. That's your testimony today. Calling for the genocide of Jews is depending upon the context. That is not bullying or harassment. This is the easiest question to answer yes, Ms. McGill.
It can be harassment, yes.
Conduct meaning committing the act of genocide? The speech is not harassment. This is unacceptable, Ms. McGill. I'm going to give you one more opportunity for the world to see your answer.
It can be harassment.
The answer is yes. And Dr. Gay, at Harvard, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment? Yes or no?
It can be, depending on the context.
What's the context?
Targeted as an individual, targeted at an individual.
It's targeted at Jewish students, Jewish individuals.
Anti-Semitic rhetoric, when it crosses into conduct that amounts to bullying, harassment, intimidation, that is actionable conduct, and we do take action. Again, it depends on the context.
It does not depend on the context.
Now, this is Harvard and Penn. Just imagine for a second if that same question was asked about any other minority group. Hey, does the calling for the genocide of the LGBT community violate these schools' conduct? Of course it does. But for whatever reason, with regards to Jewish people, unless it turns into actual genocide, well, it needs to be contextualized. So listen, I'm not going to tell you guys what to think. I think if you go and sit with the best of the best on these conversations, go sit with Coleman Hughes and Dave Smith, go sit with Trigonometry's videos on this. I think most of us, if we're really open and we haven't created a dogma that's anti-Israel and anti-Jewish in our brain, we'll come to sensible conclusions on that matter, that Israel is not without fault, but goodness gracious, is it held to a wild double standard in today's climate? So I'd love to hear from you guys. And fair warning, if you drop the "you got $7,000 dude shill" from Israel, you're just going to get completely blocked on this channel. I'm not going to engage with it. But I do want to hear from you guys. And if you want to hear a part 2 or any specific things covered in a part 2 of this video, drop it in the comment section below. And if you want to shop our Black Friday Cyber Monday sale, it'll be somewhere on the screen. Go get yourself a Bless God prayer journal, get yourself a Bless God Dove hat, one of our amazing t-shirts, all available right now. The lowest prices of the year, and there's only one day left. All right, I'll see you over there.